She didn't know his name, but she knew his heartbeat because it echoed in hers that night. The wind howled like a starving animal, ripping through the pines and lashing snow across the mountain slope. Grace pushed forward anyway, her boots sinking deep into the fresh powder with every step. She had not meant to be out this long. The sun had vanished hours ago, and the storm came faster than predicted. Her flashlight was dying, her breath fogged with every desperate gasp. Just 10 more minutes, she told herself. 10 more minutes, and she would reach the old hunting cabin she had been repairing for weeks. The only shelter she had. Then she saw it. Something dark jutted out from the white expanse ahead. It wasn't a tree, it wasn't rock, it was a man. She stumbled forward, her heart climbing into her throat. He was lying half buried in snow, motionless, his lips blue and eyelids rimmed with frost. His clothes were expensive, tailored for city life, not wilderness. She dropped beside him, fingers trembling as she pressed to find a pulse on his neck. It was faint, so faint it barely existed. "Hey," she whispered, shaking him. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. Panic flared in her chest, but instinct moved faster. She hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and dragged him as best she could step by agonizing step toward the cabin still hidden behind trees. Snow clung to her lashes, her coat soaked through, but she didn't stop. It took nearly 20 minutes. She barely made it inside before collapsing next to his body on the wooden floor. He needed warmth, now. She stripped off his coat sweater shirt. His chest was icy to the touch. Every breath he drew was shallow, barely there. Grace stood over him for half a second, her breath catching as she looked down. Her hands trembled as she began removing her own soaked layers. Her sweater, her thermal undershirt, her bra, everything until there was nothing between her and the cold. Then she lay down beside him, chest to chest, skin to skin. She pulled a wool blanket over them both and wrapped her arms tightly around his body. His skin was like marble. She whispered to him in the dark, just nonsense, soft words, pleas, stories, anything to keep herself from falling asleep, anything to keep him tethered to this world. She didn't know how long she lay there. Time unraveled. The storm raged outside, but the only sound she truly heard was the sluggish rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. Then a whisper. "Don't leave," he said so faintly she thought she imagined it. "You feel like home." She froze, then felt his arms weak but deliberate wrap around her. He pulled her closer, one hand sliding up her back, the other cupping the base of her neck. His lips brushed her temple, her cheek. She should have pulled away, but the moment was thick with something ancient and raw, something that had no name. The lines between survival and surrender blurred, and in that space where silence reigned, her body moved with a will of its own. She gave him warmth. She gave him life. She gave him the last piece of herself she had guarded for so long. It was not tender. It was not planned. It was breathless, desperate, and tangled in pain. But it was real, and for one night it was theirs. He drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of memories, grief names she did not recognize. She held him tighter each time, grounding him in the present. By dawn, the storm had eased. The light was silver soft, falling through cracked wooden panels like a gentle promise. His chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm now. Color returned to his lips. Grace sat up slowly, dressed herself in silence, and looked down at the man she had saved. She didn't know his name, where he came from, why he fell from the sky. but she knew she could not be there when he opened his eyes. So she left, quietly, like a ghost that had come only to keep death away. Grace didn't return to the cabin for 3 days. She stayed low in her own shelter, deeper in the woods, uncertain if the man had survived, or if he had left, or if she even wanted to know. Something inside her had changed that night, something she couldn't name. She had given him warmth, yes, but also a part of herself she had never intended to give anyone. Not like that. Not without a name, not without a face she could place in memory. She told herself it was survival, that she did what she had to do, that she saved a man's life and walked away. But that didn't stop the nights from growing longer, or her hands from shaking every time she thought of his whisper, "You feel like home." That sentence haunted her far more than the moment itself. And yet when she did finally return, the cabin was empty, neat, repaired. A folded note sat on the rough wooden table, weighted by a small polished stone. She stared at it for long minutes before daring to open it. In a hand that was sharp but elegant, the words read, "I don't know who you are, but I remember your voice. I remember the way you held me. Whoever you are, you gave me more than warmth. You gave me back my life. Thank you. No name, no signature, just that." Grace stood in the doorway for a long time afterward, the wind still brushing the trees like a lullaby, and wondered if maybe that was the end, that she had saved someone powerful and faceless, and now she could go back to the garden she kept, the life she had carved out alone, and pretend nothing happened. It would have been easier that way. For 3 weeks, life did return to its strange rhythm. She worked in the soil behind the church that let her stay rent-free in exchange for tending their grounds. She sold her vegetables and herbs at the farmer's market every Sunday. She smiled to the same 5 old women who always commented on her hair. She kept her past buried like always, until one morning, under a sky clean and cold, a car too expensive for their valley pulled into the market. It didn't belong. Glossy black-tinted windows, no license plate in the front. Heads turned. Whispers followed. But Grace didn't look. She focused on stacking her squash, washing her hands in the metal basin, avoiding attention the way she always had. Then she saw the boots. They were dark leather, expensive, not worn for utility. They stopped in front of her table. Slowly her eyes traveled up. Tailored pants, a dark wool coat, a face, and then a gaze. Eyes the color of stormlight, deep, sharp, haunted. Recognition hit her like a wave. Adrian Stone. She had seen his photo before, years ago. In a newspaper someone had left behind. But now that face was no longer printed on newsprint. It was flesh and bone, standing 3 feet from her, eyes locked on hers like he had been waiting years. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her breath caught. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her like she was a memory he wasn't sure was real. Then he spoke, voice low and steady. "Lavender. That was the first thing I smelled when I woke up. And you're selling it." Grace didn't respond. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She couldn't run. Not now, not here, and not from him. "You're mistaken," she said quietly. "You must be confusing me with someone else. Maybe, but I don't think I am." His words weren't forceful. They were filled with quiet certainty and something else, a searching. He looked down at the small bouquet of herbs on the table, picked up a bundle wrapped in twine, and held it to his nose. Still lavender, same scent, same as that night. She could feel her pulse beating in her throat. She thought of all the ways to deny it, all the reasons to keep lying, but she didn't. She just looked at him and asked, "What do you want from me?" Adrian paused, then said, "I want to talk. Somewhere quieter." She hesitated. The world slowed around her. And then, against every survival instinct she had spent her life developing, she nodded. They sat together that afternoon in a quiet part of the forest, where the trees were tall and the snow hadn't yet melted from winter's last storm. He didn't press, he didn't mention the night. He asked about her garden, her favorite tea, her thoughts on silence. She answered cautiously, surprised by the way he listened, really listened. There was no flirtation in his words, no pressure, only presence. When the sky turned pink and gold, he stood. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted to see your face again." "And now I have." He gave her a card then, plain. Just his name, Adrian Stone, and a number, in case you ever need anything, or if you ever want to remember. He left before she could answer, and Grace sat there, the card in her palm, and knew in that moment nothing would ever return to how it was before. Grace didn't call. Not that week, not the next. She tucked the card into the back of her recipe journal, as if by burying it beneath pages of old soup notes and herbal combinations. She could also bury the memory of his voice, his eyes, the impossible calm he carried, even when she knew deep down that he remembered everything. But he didn't wait for her to call. Instead, 3 weeks later, he came back. Not to the market, not to the village, to her garden. She heard the sound of boots crunching soil before she saw him standing by the edge of her fence, wearing a dark coat that somehow looked out of place against the wild lavender she had just finished watering. She froze. Adrian simply nodded, then said, "I bought the Caro estate. It's less than 10 minutes from here. I could use someone to bring it back to life." She stared. That estate had been abandoned for decades. Rumors said it was cursed. Crows never left its gates. People whispered. But it was also the largest piece of land in the region, and the garden there was overrun, dead, forgotten. Grace didn't ask why. She didn't ask how. She only looked at him for a long time and said, "If I say yes, it's just the garden." He nodded once, just the garden. The next morning she stood at the gates of the Caro estate, wind slicing through her jacket, heart hammering. The house was quiet, almost mournful in its grandeur, but the land was wild, untouched, a place of lost things. He met her at the back, where an overgrown path led to what was once a greenhouse. "I want this space to live again," he said, "but I don't want anyone else to touch it, only you." Grace didn't ask why he cared. She didn't ask what he was trying to resurrect. She only nodded and began. Days became weeks. She arrived early each morning and left before sunset. He was always there. Sometimes near, sometimes distant, but never gone. He brought her tea when it rained, asked her what the soil needed, watched her hands as they moved through earth like she was coaxing the land back to breath. Slowly, impossibly, she began to soften. They started talking over late afternoon cups of mint and honey. He would sit beside her on the stone bench she cleared, letting silence fill the space between them until it turned warm. He never asked about that night, never touched her without permission, but she felt it. In the way his gaze lingered on the strand of hair she forgot to tuck away. In the way his breath caught when she laughed without meaning to. In the stillness that wrapped around them when their hands brushed over the same rose stem. Once she pricked her finger on a thorn. He reached out before she could stop him, brought her hand to his mouth, and kissed the drop of blood from her skin. She didn't move, neither did he. That night she dreamt of hands on skin, not from desperation, but from desire, of heat that didn't come from fire, of a man who looked at her like she was not broken, like she was something he wanted to learn, not fix. One afternoon, thunder rolled in early. She had stayed longer than usual, lost in the scent of fresh jasmine blooms she'd finally coaxed to flower. Rain began to fall heavy and unrelenting. She tried to run, but Adrian was there, waiting. He opened the front doors and called her in. The house was warmer than she expected, books on tables, a kettle already steaming. He handed her a towel, then stood back. "There's soup if you're hungry." She hesitated, then stepped inside. It was the first time she'd been past the garden gate. They ate on opposite sides of a long oak table, the windows fogged with steam. It smelled of thyme and rosemary. She watched him while he spoke of quiet things, music, mountains, the way stars looked from the roof of a house with no power. He asked about her herbs. She told him about lavender for sleep peppermint, for clarity chamomile for guilt. He smiled slow and soft. "What's the cure for wanting something you can't have?" She didn't answer, couldn't. Her throat tightened. That night as she walked home, she touched her chest where his eyes had lingered. She couldn't stop trembling. The next week, things changed, slightly, subtly. He would stand closer when she watered the roses. Their fingers would graze over the same garden tools. She would feel his presence before hearing his voice. There was no force, no chase, just gravity. One afternoon, she arrived to find the entire greenhouse cleared of debris, replaced with a single wooden bench and 2 steaming cups of tea. "I thought maybe we could sit," he said. "Just sit." She did. And in that silence, as the sun cast gold through the glass, something shifted. He told her about his mother, about her laugh, her gardens, how she used to dance barefoot in the rain, how losing her was like losing the light inside his ribs. She listened, holding her cup, not speaking. Then she told him about the night her mother died, about how she lay in bed shivering, too cold, too weak, how Grace had read about human warmth, how she had curled herself around the dying body, praying her skin could become fire. Neither spoke for a long time after that, but when his hand found hers beneath the bench, she didn't pull away. It was the smallest touch, but it echoed louder than anything that had come before. After that, they found excuses to be near. A broken tool, a rare seed, the weather. But the truth was simple. They wanted to be near. He began to walk her home, just part of the path, then all of it. Then he lingered at her gate. One evening he said her name like it was a question. "Grace." She turned. "I'm not asking for anything, I just—" He stopped, then said, "I think about you more than I should." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think about you too." They didn't kiss, not then. But the air between them had already changed. Their story was no longer made of snow and silence. It was growing, like the garden, wild, relentless, beautiful. The box was small, made of cedarwood, tucked behind a shelf of old gardening manuals in the mansion's forgotten library. Grace found it by accident. She had been rearranging books to make room for a new collection of seed guides when the box slipped from behind a row of dusty encyclopedias. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and the lid cracked open. Inside were photographs, papers, and a folded letter that stopped her breath the moment she read the name printed on the header. Langston. her name, or rather the name she had buried, her father's name, the one she had sworn to leave behind when she fled the city, the scandal and the wreckage of a past that never really belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she lifted the papers, old company documents, a list of financial transfers, a memo signed by her father's hand, and finally the photo. Her father younger standing beside another man, a man with sharp eyes and a familiar jawline. Adrian's father. She sat down hard on the floor, her breath catching in her throat. The story she had worked so hard to erase unfolded before her eyes. Her father, once the trusted advisor to the Stone family, had betrayed them, had siphoned money, had sold secrets. The scandal had destroyed the Stone Empire's legacy, and months later, Adrian's mother had died. Suicide, they said. Heartbreak, some whispered. Grace had been only 15, then shielded from the media by a mother too exhausted to speak, and a house that grew colder with each headline. But she remembered the silence, the shame, the guilt she wore like a second skin, even after changing her name and disappearing into the mountains. Now it was here, all of it, sitting in her lap inside the house, of the man she had come to trust, the man whose heart she had begun to feel echo in her own, the man she had saved with her body and now loved in silence. Her mind raced. Had he known? Was this some twisted game, a long, slow revenge? But then she remembered his touch, his stillness, the way he had never pushed, only waited. No, he didn't know, not yet, but he would. And when he did, she would be the face of everything he hated. She put the papers back in the box, closed it, and stood. The library felt colder now, the mansion darker. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat outside the greenhouse until dawn, her eyes red and dry, her fingers clenched around the handle of her bag. By morning she had decided. She couldn't stay, couldn't let him find out the truth from her lips or worse from someone else. She left a note on the bench inside the greenhouse. Just one line. "I'm sorry for giving you warmth that wasn't mine to offer." Then she left, packed a small bag, walked down the path alone, didn't look back. The wind followed her through the trees like a whisper that would not quiet. She didn't return to the church, didn't go home. She rented a room in a town 20 miles south and found work at a roadside diner where no one asked questions. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his eyes, the garden, the moment his hand brushed hers beneath the bench. She told herself it was better this way, that she was protecting him, protecting them both from a truth that could only destroy. But it didn't stop her from missing him so badly, her chest ached. A week passed, then 2. On the 14th day, a car pulled into the diner parking lot. She saw it from the kitchen window, the same glossy black car that had once appeared at her farmer's market stand. Her hands went cold. She ducked behind the freezer door, her breath catching, but it was too late. When she stepped into the front of the diner, he was already there. Adrian, standing at the counter, eyes scanning the room until they found her. He didn't say anything at first, neither did she. Then quietly he asked, "Why did you leave?" Her voice shook. "You found the box, didn't you?" "Yes, did you read it?" "Yes, so now you know who I am, who my father was, everything he took from you, everything he destroyed." Adrian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "No, I know who he was. I don't know who you are." "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "From what? From the past. From me. From having to look at my face and see every memory that hurts you." He stepped closer. Grace. When I read those files, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. I understood something I hadn't for years. That the night my mother died, I lost not just a parent, but the ability to trust anyone. Until you. You brought life back into a place I thought was dead forever. That wasn't your father. That was you. She blinked hard, her throat tight. I don't deserve you, maybe not, but I choose you, and I'll keep choosing you, even if I have to find you in every corner of this world. He reached for her hand then. This time she didn't pull away. Grace didn't return to the estate right away. Even after Adrian's words, after the quiet way his fingers wrapped around hers, like an anchor in the storm, she hesitated. Some wounds didn't close with one promise, and hers had been open for years. But he came back the next day, not with pressure, not with persuasion, just with presence. He sat outside the diner through her entire shift waiting. When she walked out that evening, he didn't speak, only handed her a thermos of chamomile tea. She stood there on the sidewalk, looking at him in the orange light of dusk, and the weight of everything she had been carrying broke. So she went with him, quietly, wordlessly, back to the place where it had all begun. The garden was blooming, wild, imperfect, and alive, just like the connection that had grown between them. The first night back, she slept in the guest room. The second night, she fell asleep, reading beside him on the couch. By the third, she didn't bother saying good night. She stayed. In the room that slowly began to smell like lavender and warm linen, and something unnameable that lived between shared silences. They didn't speak of love, not yet, but it was there in every glance, every gesture, in the way he memorized her breakfast habits, in the way she folded his shirts without thinking, in the way their bodies leaned toward each other without invitation. They began building a life, not with plans, but with presence. Until one morning everything cracked. Adrian stood on the back porch phone in hand expression carved from stone. Grace saw the tension in his shoulders before she even heard his voice. He ended the call with a sharp breath and turned to her slowly. That was the board. My cousin Bryce has filed an injunction against my ownership of the estate. He claims my mental stability is compromised, and that I'm being manipulated by someone with a conflict of interest. She froze. Conflict of interest? He met her eyes. He's naming you. He's using your father's history as proof that this is a scheme, that you've been planning to take me down from inside. Grace felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. I haven't spoken to my father in years. I've never touched your company. Adrian stepped closer. I know that, and the board knows that, but public perception doesn't care. He explained further. Bryce was feeding the story to investors threatening a vote to remove Adrian as CEO. If he lost the vote, everything they had built would be gone. Not just the company, the estate, the gardens, their peace, their world. She backed away slowly as if the space between them could shield him from what was coming. I should go. No, yes. This is my fault. I should have told you who I was the first day. Adrian's voice dropped. If you leave now, you prove them right, that you were never meant to stay. She looked at him, tears rising, fists clenched. I'm not afraid for me. I'm afraid of being the reason you lose everything. He shook his head. You're not the reason I'd lose everything. You're the reason I remembered what it was for. But his words weren't enough to drown the fear. That night she packed her things. He found her at the door. Grace, don't. She couldn't meet his gaze. I love you. That's why I'm leaving. Because if I stay and they destroy you, I won't survive it." She stepped past him and walked into the night. Rain fell soft and cold, soaking through her coat as she disappeared down the winding road. Adrian didn't follow. Not that night. Instead, he stood alone in the garden they had built, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her. The air smelled like wet soil and grief. The next morning, the story broke. Anonymous leaks, a whispered scandal. The media twisted the truth-painting Grace as the daughter of a corporate traitor who had seduced his heir for revenge. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators speculated. Board members panicked. Adrian was summoned to an emergency vote. He sat at the head of a long table, eyes sharp, jaw clenched. The room buzzed with tension. Bryce stood confidently, delivering a speech about legacy, stability, and trust. Adrian let him finish, then rose. "I have spent years rebuilding not just a company, but a name my mother died protecting. A name that means more to me than any of you will ever understand. The woman you're afraid of did not come to me for power. She came to me with hands full of soil and a heart that taught me how to breathe again. I will not erase her because you are afraid of ghosts." He paused, his voice steady. "If you want to vote me out, do it. But know that you're voting out the last thing in this company that still has a soul." The room fell silent. One by one, the votes came in. He kept his seat. Barely, but it was enough. When the meeting ended, Adrian didn't go home. He drove, for hours, through winding roads and unfamiliar towns. Until he found the diner. She wasn't there. A coworker said she had quit that morning, said she left no forwarding address. He drove more, asked more. Finally, a farmer on the edge of town remembered a girl who traded lavender seeds for eggs and smiled like she was trying not to be seen. He found her in a small cabin behind a sunflower field, standing on the porch with a mug in her hand. When she saw him, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only looked at him like he was the answer to every question she was too afraid to ask. He walked up the steps, took the mug from her hand, pulled her close. "I didn't fight for the company. I fought for you. Because every time I see you, I remember who I was supposed to be before the world told me to forget." She buried her face in his chest. "I thought I was doing the right thing. You were. But the right thing now is coming home." And she did, with nothing but a bag of dried lavender and the man who had always been waiting. They didn't speak on the drive back. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, the hum of the engine, the only sound between them. But silence had long ago become their language. When they arrived at the estate, the house stood quiet under a pale morning sky. The garden soaked from last night's rain petals trembling in the wind. He reached over and opened her door, waited for her to step out, and then followed her through the same gate where everything once began. She paused just past the greenhouse, her breath catching as she looked at the flowers they had grown together. The roses were fuller. The lavender had crept across the stone path. It felt alive again, and for a moment, so did she. Adrian placed his hand gently on her lower back, guiding her forward. "Come with me," he said softly. "I want to show you something." She followed him inside the house, through the long corridor, where sun painted soft streaks across the wooden floor, into the west wing she had never entered. The room he opened was empty, except for a single wooden box resting on a table near the window. He walked to it, lifted the lid, and pulled out a handful of old photos and papers. She recognized them instantly. The documents from the library, the evidence of her father's betrayal. Her chest tightened, but Adrian turned toward her before she could speak. "I didn't burn them," he said, "because pretending the past didn't happen won't make it go away. But I've decided something." He crossed the room and placed the box in her hands. "This is yours. I won't carry it anymore, and neither should you." She stared at the box, her fingers tracing the edges. It felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Closure, or at least the beginning of it. She set it down on the windowsill and stepped closer to him. Her voice was soft. "And what about your board, your company, your legacy?" He looked at her like she was the only thing that ever mattered. "My legacy is not built on vengeance. It's built on the choices I make today. And today I choose you." Her throat closed, her heart swelled. She wanted to say something, but he reached up and brushed her hair behind her ear, and in that moment words didn't matter. He kissed her then, not with urgency, not with desperation, but with the slow ache of someone who had waited too long. She melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her lips answering everything they had left unsaid. They moved together through the room, the quiet interrupted only by breath and heartbeat. He lifted her gently, carried her to the old chaise by the window, where sunlight painted them gold. When his hands touched her skin, she didn't flinch. When her fingers slid beneath his shirt, he didn't rush. They made love like people who had survived fire and come out softer. Her body moved with his, in a rhythm that felt older than language, a slow and steady unraveling of all the walls they had built. He whispered her name like a vow. She held his face like a prayer. When they finally lay still, tangled in each other, the world felt quieter. He traced the scar near her collarbone, a mark she had always hidden, and asked nothing. She kissed his chest and listened to the steadiness of his heart. Hours passed, maybe longer. When she woke, he was still there, holding her like she was something precious. Like she wasn't the daughter of a man who had stolen everything from him. He smiled when she opened her eyes. "Stay," he said. "Not for the garden, not for what we built. For us." She nodded without speaking. That evening they walked together through the estate hand in hand. He showed her the blueprints for a new wing in the greenhouse, a place to grow herbs for healing, a small shop, a community space. "I want to give something back to this town," he told her. "Something that lives beyond the stone name. And I want you to lead it." She laughed quietly. "Me, I just grow plants. You heal people, Grace." "I've seen it. You just use your hands instead of medicine." The next morning they announced the project. He called it Haven. A place for anyone carrying too much history, too much grief, too many invisible wounds. The townspeople were hesitant at first, but as days passed and the flowers bloomed and the air smelled of basil and earth and hope, they came, slowly then in waves. Adrian watched it all unfold with quiet awe. And every night he returned to her. They built something that wasn't flashy or headline-worthy, but it was real, and it was theirs. The official opening of Haven came 6 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning kissed by sunlight and the scent of early summer. There was no press, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just neighbors, volunteers, a few curious travelers, and a garden in full bloom. Grace stood at the center of it, all barefoot, on the warm stone path, her hands smudged with soil, and her heart steady in a way it had never been. She moved through the greenhouse like she belonged to it, like her breath had always been synced to the rhythm of blooming things. Adrian stood at her side, not as a man who owned the land, but as someone who had surrendered to something deeper than legacy, something stronger than pride. They had worked for this together. Every seed, every wooden bench, every painted pot placed in the corners of the community healing room bore the imprint of shared labor, quiet mornings and nights where they dreamed aloud under stars with fingers entwined. Children wandered the paths, now giggling as they chased butterflies, their laughter echoing through the glass panes and filling every crevice with warmth. A woman sat under the fig tree, eyes closed the curve of her shoulders, finally relaxing after weeks of grief. An old man with shaking hands trimmed rosemary beside a volunteer who listened without interrupting. No one spoke of trauma here. No one had to. This place was built not to fix, but to hold, to shelter, to let people remember who they were beneath all the noise. And at the center of it all was Grace. She wore no name tag, no title. People simply called her Grace, and that was enough. She had found herself again, not through grand gestures, but in the stillness between each act of care. That evening, as the last guests left, and the sky deepened into the soft blue of dusk, she walked the perimeter of the garden alone. The lavender rose shimmered with bees, the tomato vines heavy with fruit. It was perfect in the most imperfect way. Adrian found her near the old bench where they had first shared their secrets. He didn't speak at first, only handed her a cup of mint tea and sat beside her. They watched the sun dip low. Then he turned toward her, eyes softer than she had ever seen. "I want to build something else," he said. "Something more." She smiled gently. "Another greenhouse, Numa life, with you." She looked at him, surprise flickering through her chest. "I thought we were already doing that." "We are, but I want to do it deliberately, with intention." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. No diamond, no flash. Just a smooth band engraved on the inside with the word home. "I don't want a ceremony. I don't need guests or vows. I just need this. You, here, every day." Her eyes filled. Slowly she extended her hand, not shaking, not hesitant, just certain. He slipped the ring on her finger, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead. That night they didn't celebrate with champagne or music. They sat on the floor of their little cottage, just beyond the garden legs, tangled sharing bread and cheese, and laughing about the time their irrigation system flooded the herb beds. It was the kind of night that didn't need to be remembered, because it would never be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Haven grew, more than they expected. Donations arrived anonymously. Volunteers showed up from other states. A former nurse offered to host trauma recovery workshops. A retired chef taught cooking classes with herbs straight from the garden. Grace kept things simple. She rose early, fed the chickens, brewed tea, tended to her plants. And every night, Adrian was there waiting. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But she always fell asleep with her head on his chest, his hand on her waist, their breaths in sync. One morning she found a small envelope on her work table. Inside was a deed. He had transferred half the estate to her. Her name on the paper, no conditions, no legal traps, just trust. She stood in the garden holding that paper for a long time. Then she folded it, placed it inside her recipe journal, and got back to planting. They didn't talk about the past anymore. Not out of avoidance, but because it no longer defined the present. Her father had passed quietly in the nursing home. Adrian had attended the funeral with her, standing quietly at the back, his hand wrapped in hers. There had been no blame, only silence, and then release. One night in early autumn, Grace sat by the fire notebook in hand-scribbling ideas for a seed exchange program. Adrian came in holding a small wooden frame. He placed it beside her on the table. It was the photograph of her father and Adrian's, the same one she had found months ago. But now beneath it, he had added another picture, a recent one. The two of them standing in the garden dirt on their hands, the sun in their hair. 2 stories, 2 generations, one healing. She touched the frame, then looked at him. "You sure you want this in here?" He nodded. "Because this isn't a story about betrayal anymore. It's a story about becoming, and we became something good." That night they made love with no urgency, no weight, just softness, fingers mapping familiar territory lips, finding home again and again. They moved slowly, reverently, as if honoring every version of themselves they had shed to arrive at this moment. Afterward, she lay on his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath her ear. The same heartbeat she had once heard beneath layers of snow and silence. The same one she had saved, the same one that now saved her. She whispered into the quiet, "I don't want to go back to how things were." He kissed the top of her head. "We're not going back. We're building something new. Together." Sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one who shouts the loudest or shows up with grand gestures, but the one who lies beside you in silence when the world forgets you exist. Grace never planned to love him. She never planned to be seen. But sometimes life chooses for you in moments carved by cold hands and quiet nights in choices made without words in touch that speaks before thought can form. She gave warmth without a name. He gave her forever without condition, and what they built was not just a garden or a sanctuary, but a life sewn together from loss and patience and courage. In another world, maybe they never meet. Maybe he dies in the snow. Maybe she never opens that cabin door. But in this one they did, and every day afterward they chose to stay. There were still questions that lingered sometimes, still moments when fear crept back, in whispering that maybe love like this was too fragile to last. But then she'd feel his hand in hers strong and steady, or he'd wake to the smell of rosemary in her hair, and remember what it felt like to be needed for more than his name. In the end, it wasn't perfection that saved them. It wasn't purity or forgiveness or time. It was presence. It was showing up, again and again, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. And maybe that's what real love is. Not the kind that erases your scars, but the kind that plants something beautiful in the soil of them. They didn't belong together by the world's standards. Different names, different pasts, opposite worlds. But hearts don't care about pedigree, and pain doesn't discriminate. And real healing doesn't ask who started the fire, only who stayed to rebuild. He used to say she smelled like lavender and earth and sunlight. She used to say he felt like shelter. And maybe that was all they ever really needed, a place to rest, a person to rest with. A home that wasn't walls but warmth. She gave her body once to save him. He gave his soul to love her. And when the world looked at them and said they didn't fit, they smiled and planted more flowers. Not to prove a point, just to remind themselves that even in the coldest places, something beautiful can grow. Love like that doesn't always make headlines, but it makes history in the heart, and for them that was enough.